It goes by many names: the pestilence, the great mortality, and more commonly as the Black Death. Humanity has suffered from disease throughout history, from stories in the Bible to the modern-day COVID-19. However, none have come close to the plague. The story of the bubonic plague is the story of a perfect storm, a massive pandemic and plague that devastated humanity. The Black Death is by far the worst pandemic in history. While it was estimated that 30 to 40% of Europe perished, worldwide the death toll exceeds 200 million. I have researched the plagues of the past to better understand our modern pandemics, and I would like to share my findings with you all today. So I will tell you the origins of the plague, its spread into Europe, and its impact on medieval Europe. So the origins of the plague, according to History.com, is that we know the bacterium that causes the Black Death, scientifically known as Yersinia pestis, had been around for humans for centuries, mostly inhabiting fleas and rats. Outbreaks of the plague had occurred for years in Central Asia and China before the major outbreak in Europe. And it is believed that the Black Death must have mutated a few years or a decade or so before 1346. This mutation creates the perfect storm of virulence and contagiousness, allowing it to infect humans on a far grander scale. And this mutation is thought to have also occurred a short time after the Silk Road was reopened by the Mongols, which resulted in a trade boom, but also greatly accelerated the spread of disease. So, now that we know the origins of the Black Death, we will move on to describe its spread into Europe and how that exactly happened. So, the spread of the plague, according to origins.edu, the first documented report of what would become the Black Death in Europe was from the port city of Kaffa in the Crimean Peninsula, which is now modern Ukraine. A diseased army of Mongols arrives to besiege the city, and a large amount of this Mongol force begins to die in mass from the plague. The Mongol leaders, not knowing what to do with the corpses, began catapulting the rotting corpses into the city. This action not only infected the city and the populace, but it also caused mass terror among the civilians. The people of Kaffa, along with many Italian merchants who had been trading there, who were now all infected with the Black Death, began to flee the city on ships. These death ships, as they would come to be known, docked in ports all over the Mediterranean Sea, and these ships are considered the watershed moment which greatly accelerated the spread of the Black Death into Europe. So, for examples on how fast it actually spread, by 1348, 2 years after the ships had left Kaffa and arrived in Italy and other ports in the Mediterranean, the plague had already reached Paris and central Spain. By 1349, a year later, it had reached London and northern Germany, and 1 year later, in 1350, it had reached Russia and Scandinavia. Okay, so now that we know how the plague entered Europe, I will finish by explaining its immediate and long-lasting impact on the European population. So the impacts of the Black Death, according to Britannica.com, are that the Black Death was terrifyingly and indiscriminately contagious. It was also extremely virulent. A common saying of the time was you could go to bed perfectly healthy, but be dead by breakfast. Entire populations of towns and villages were wiped out in mere days, while major cities like Paris and London became heavily depopulated. Within 4 years of the start of the pandemic, half of Europe's population was dead, and it would take almost 2 centuries for the European population to recover to pre-pandemic levels. And one interesting little thing that scientists have noted is that oftentimes if a mother or a female survived the Black Death, the plague, their children would oftentimes be naturally more resistant to it. Or if the mother was already resistant to it, her children would often also be resistant to it, which is a little funny little fact. So in conclusion, today we learned about the Black Death. We looked at its origins coming out of rats and fleas in China and Central Asia. We then looked at its spread down the Silk Road through the death ships to Europe. We then talked about the short-term and long-lasting effects of this catastrophic disease and pandemic. In just 10 years, millions upon millions of people, rich and poor, noble and peasant, died. And as we move forward through history and modern pandemics, it's imperative to understand the past, to learn and prepare for the future. Thank you.